Welcome everybody to this launch for What I Believe, which is a collection of transcripts based on a podcast, a popular podcast. How many of you have heard the podcast? You've all heard the podcast. That's right. Not many of you, actually. Not many of you. You're more of a reading sort of audience, which is good. Welcome. The genesis of the What I Believe book, which is really the same as the genesis of the What I Believe podcast, obviously, were two essays written in the early 20th century by Ian Forster and Bertrand Russell, two giants of the humanist movement. They both wrote essays, What I Believe. And the reason those essays were so popular as they were and remained in print for so many decades was because they were two famous people who people had heard of. Bertrand Russell as a broadcaster, as a sort of public intellectual. Ian Forster is obviously arguably the most successful, well-known novelist of the time. So they were people that the public already knew, and they were setting out, their approach to life. And so it was an opportunity to look inside the mind of someone that you already sort of felt you knew a bit, like people do feel they know famous people a bit, same today as it was then. And that was the inspiration for the podcast, which tried to do the same thing, talk to humanists who were famous for other reasons, either as scientists or novelists, broadcasters, all sorts of people we had in there, actors and journalists. You'll know if you ever listen to the podcast that there's a wide range of people there, and give listeners the opportunity to hear more about those people's approach to life, because it is something that people find interesting. And the second reason why it was an inspiration for the podcast was because although Ian Forster and Bertrand Russell were both humanists and very involved in the humanist movement and both laid out a humanist approach to life, actually the emphasis that they gave, different values and different beliefs, the approach that they took, and the concepts that they cared about and wanted to promote, nonetheless were different from each other. There was diversity in their different accounts of what a humanist view means and should mean, and why people should adopt it. And we tried to take the same approach in both the podcast and this book. There are a diverse range of perspectives in it, not just diverse because of the type of different intellectual disciplines or backgrounds that the people come from, but also because often their beliefs are to do with their own social origins or their own life experiences, and of course every one of us is unique. Even every humanist is unique. No, we're not, thank you very much. It was a bit of a Christmas call out there for a very good film. So welcome this evening to this launch. We're very lucky to have the two best contributors, apart from the others who are in the audience, with us here this evening, who are the joint 5 best contributors to the book. Natalie Haynes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Classicist, broadcaster, novelist, and Diet Coke addict. And goddess.
Thank you.
And
Yes,
that's right. That's right.
I wasn't expecting a room full of humanists to come.
Everyone loves irony. Okay. And Alice. No, I meant on the goddess
Too late
thing.
now.
And Alice. And
No.
and Alice Roberts, broadcaster, scientist, and also goddess. There you go.
Thank you very much.
There we are. Well, there'll be lots of time for questions and other merriment as the evening proceeds. We're going to keep this discussion relatively brisk because we'll also have a signing of the book afterwards downstairs. And I want to give you plenty of time for questions. But I thought we'd just start by talking to each of the guests here this evening about a couple of the big themes that emerged in their own contributions to this book. I thought we'd just dive straight into it. Now, the thing that I think was most noteworthy in your interview was this. You delivered it as a sort of aside, but it was something that lots of people were sort of posting comments on the podcast channel about afterwards, was this idea where you said one of the things that really annoys you is when people try and separate.
One of the things that keep me here
one
for
of
a
the
while.
few things that you as an easygoing person get annoyed by was when people try to make out that culture is something different from nature. We were talking about different explanations of human development and the development of human societies, and I said something like, is that does that have a natural origin or has a cultural origin? And you told me off because you said that's the same thing.
Yeah. So I think one of the best quotes about this that I've heard comes from an evolutionary psychologist that I met in Leipzig, who said, humans are born expecting culture just as a fish is born expecting water. You cannot take humans out of culture. So you can't, that whole kind of idea of that that nature-nurture dichotomy that we still love, you know, we talk about character and we talk about people's skills or people's capabilities and lots of different aspects of human identity and ask, you know, how much of that is nature and how much of it is nurture? It's a totally insoluble question because one does not exist without the other for humans. You know, we've been cultural beings since we were humans. You know, it goes back to the origin of our species, and I think even earlier than that. So it's always completely enmeshed, yeah.
And this conviction motivates a lot of your other beliefs about what you're interested in, what you think human beings are, and a general approach to life, I think, was something that arose out of it. Because it sort of tied together a lot of your different interests, whether it was like we were talking about at the time, human development or the enterprise of science itself, or, you know, what human beings could be.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think that I write across quite a diverse number of disciplines now. And I increasingly, I mean, I obviously make television programmes and I, you know, I do teach at university as well, but you know, the things I teach at university are very, very much focused on medicine and the body, human anatomy, embryology, and it's all about that vocational training for medical students. But in terms of the areas that I'm writing about and the kind of, I suppose, that I'm interested in from a more philosophical perspective, I'm really interested in these different disciplines that have been viewed as quite separate. And so my last few books have been looking at particularly biology and history and the intersection between them, and the very obvious intersection when it comes to genetics and archaeology, but also actually the way that we approach those subjects. And I see history, and it'd be interesting to know what you think about this, Natalie, because I don't see history as, and I'm coming at it from a scientific perspective, obviously, and as a scientist and not as a trained historian, but the whole approach seems to me to be exactly the same as science. It seems to be an approach where you're looking for evidence and you're building up from the evidence and you're interrogating it and you're trying to knock ideas down and you're trying to get back to something which is as close to truth as you can get to. And I think that history is doing that when we're looking at human culture, and science is doing that about anything else. But the actual process seems to me to be pretty much the same.
Yeah, I mean, ancient history is difficult because the sources are, by the standards of modern historians, are not very valuable, but by the standards of classicists and ancient historians, that is literally all there is.
Yeah.
So, you know, as we're all kind of dutifully writing at school essays on bias in sources, and then as a classicist you turn to Herodotus or Thucydides and you're like, wait, what? So this is the only... Right, okay. But you just have to assess it a different way and approach it in a different way and be more maybe guarded about the conclusions that you draw. But
that's just a sampling issue. That's
exactly.
You know, it's the same as some areas of archaeology and paleoanthropology.
And trying to put those two things together.
Yeah.
So, you know, at what point in the year does Vesuvius erupt? Covering Pompeii, and the answer is, well, according to our literary sources it's one date, according to the scientific sources it's another date, according to the archaeology of what seeds and what, but then if you and it's like, well, we don't know, we can make good guesses, but we're having to kind of weigh up the evidence, and that's still happening thanks to brilliant scientists. We're changing the way we look at these things all the time. It's only in really recent years that we've known, you know, what percentage of bodies in a mass warrior grave are female, because now you can read that DNA in a way that you didn't used to be able to. You know, and that's just a really recent change. We only recently have known that, what is it, about 1 in 5 people in Roman Britain is a long-distance migrant. And, so when people got furious with the BBC for having the audacity to have a cartoon with people of colour in Roman Britain, how dare they wokeify the past, etc. It's like, well, okay, it's not my fault that your knowledge of the past comes from films you saw as a kid.
Yeah.
They weren't actually science either, just FYI. So these things are subject to constant revision. It's what we were talking beforehand about, how there's no real divide, and certainly there shouldn't be a divide between arts and sciences, because we need you guys, and you like us, so,
Yeah.
This is a very good humanist theme, the unity of those two things. Very good, very on point.
Thank
bring
you.
Bring it back to where we needed to be. But we did talk a little bit in your interview, and I'm not sure it made it into the book, about the telling of ancient history being a bit more like the telling of stories than a bit like the academic discipline of history in the modern sense. And that is also true, isn't it?
It's about telling stories, but it's also, history has a moral purpose in antiquity.
Yeah.
That I'm not sure we would feel quite as
the
convinced
historians,
by.
so the writers of history in antiquity.
Right, so they see it as being didactic, that you can learn how to be, and you see it maybe more with what we would call biography, but that distinction is more obvious to us than it is in antiquity. But when, I don't know, Plutarch takes on a life of someone like Mark Antony, the idea is, how do we learn about what kind of person Mark Antony is? History, biography, but also here is a moral lesson in how
and a noble soul.
Being a drunk was always going to be his undoing.
Yeah.
And also, by the way, I'm much more interested in Cleopatra, she seems cool, is what happens when he's writing it. And you realise that, ancient historians were just people, and sometimes they get distracted. So, with Herodotus, sometimes there are things he's just interested in. And I was thinking of him, I guess, when you were talking about culture enmeshing us, because I think, is that maybe the earliest or one of the earliest stories of someone trying to work out if there are people without culture, is when, I've forgotten which king, decides that 2 children should be brought up absent of any language. And then the idea is, obviously, I'm not advocating this as...
This is not ethical.
Almost no child-rearing advice in antiquity is going to do anything other than lead to an early grave for a child, so I'm not advocating it. But they are brought up without language, and the first word they speak is bekos, which means bread, in whichever language it is they decide then has primacy.
It's the prime one,
And it's like, well, this is an attempt to divorce humans from culture, and look how well it goes. It doesn't work at all.
How fascinating.
Right?
Yeah.
You love Herodotus.
I've only read little bits.
Oh, really?
You're going to like him.
Yeah, you're going to enjoy Herodotus, definitely. You had a bit in what you were saying about the importance, actually, of history not making heroes out of people. We were talking about the epic story of our ancestors and the way that some people like to, to write the history, almost the prehistory of human civilization in a way that actually, an ancient hagiographist would love this, sort of like our heroic ancestors who have brought us to this wonderful, wonderful point. And you made the point about how that was, pretty outrageous and silly thing to do.
I mean, I just think we love hagiography. We love lives of saints, and we still do it, and we are still very much doing it when it comes to writing about contemporary science. It's very, very strange, and it's so kind of in our culture in a very, very odd way. There will be some probably university academics or people who have been in universities and are kind of aware of these slightly arcane things, but we do really weird things in universities where we measure the teaching we do as teamwork, whereas we measure research on an individual basis, which I find very odd. And it's kind of, it's kind of appraised on it's as though research is carried out by individuals working on their own, and teaching is carried out by teams. And you go, no, it's all teamwork. This is very strange indeed. And often when we write about history of scientific discoveries, and of course what we've had to do is a constant revision of that, because you've just got one person being put up as the person that made an amazing breakthrough. I mean, again, that idea of breakthroughs, it's all kind of incremental, and very often, there's a long history of leaving all the women out, So for a long time, we're just thinking about Watson and Crick discovering DNA. Certainly what I was taught at school, nobody mentioned Rosalind Franklin. So we're kind of getting better, I think, at recognising the teams, but we're still doing it. We're still saying this person discovered this thing. And we will write the history of science as a history of heroes, individuals struggling against the odds, and then coming back with the prize and giving it to humanity.
Everyone loves a quest story.
That's right.
Yeah.
And this was actually a common theme of almost everyone who spoke about this type of theme in the book, was to reject this idea of individual heroes in favour of a more gradual or cooperative or social-based model of how things changed. Maybe that is a common humanist idea. And you don't get... I think whenever... We did a series once asking people to write pieces for our online magazine when we still published it, which was called something Humanist... anyway, whatever it was called. And it was very good and very memorable, and all the articles were gold dust. And it was great. Humanist Life, that was it. And we asked people to do their humanist heroes. And we emailed everyone saying, do a humanist hero. And instead of getting back a lot of descriptions of people that people admired, we got back these long essays about why you shouldn't have heroes. It was a much better attitude to recognise people who were like, okay, thanks, but with all these caveats, could you also please tell us about how great Epicurus was and or Einstein or whatever? And people did in the end. And Rosalind Franklin was one of the ones, of course, who was most chosen at that point.
Yeah. But the other thing, I think, going back to the question you originally asked me, which is kind of about this kind of heroic telling of science, with those kind of personages, but also the way we do talk about the kind of the longer term, the evolution of our species, all of that kind of thing. And it's something that I've really struggled with, because especially when you're trying to describe broad sweeps of time, and you're trying to tell a story about the origin of humanity and how humans spread around the world, for instance, which I did my first big landmark for the BBC, which was 15 years ago. I think that the tendency is to fall into that kind of quite kind of dramatic story, where it is again about people struggling against the odds and managing to survive. And I just think, and heroically, and I think, for most of the time, it's just people living. It is just people living, and it's families, and it's kids growing up, and it's ordinary. It's very ordinary. And I think we don't like those stories. We don't like to think that. And also, we want to put the agency within those heroes and within those people as well. So you can obviously go too far the other way, and you can have biological determinism and sort of environmental determinism, where you're saying that humans are not really doing anything other than responding to the environment. And obviously that's stupid as well, because we're human, we have agency, we have we're conscious, we can think about the future, we can model it, and we can make it happen. But at the same time, we are sitting here with the environment throwing things at us as well. And I mean the environment, everything that comes at you. So you've got to kind of take all of it into consideration, and we've got to be telling better stories where we're thinking about humans having agency, but we're also thinking about the fact that some things happen, and then humans are responding to them and reacting to them.
I'm going to come to a classics angle on this in a moment, but I mean, just to dwell on your point and come back to something that you said here as well, it does actually make a difference to your worldview whether you think that, clever, heroic humans invented agriculture, or some grains fell when they were milling and they noticed that they grew and thought this is a highly convenient way of proceeding from now on, doesn't it? I mean, there is something, that is two very different ways of thinking about not just human history, but the world as it is and how it could have been, and why it is the way it is. Yeah.
Oh, and also, and the kind of, we also quite like the themes of individuals struggling against the odds, and we're not necessarily thinking about whole groups of people. And there's a really big theme, I think, in if we look at human origins and we look at the kind of story of our species, I think that we would have failed at the first hurdle had we not cooperated. And very often it's all about competition. And very often we frame evolution in that way as well, you know, in a broader way, even going away from humans. It's all about nature red in tooth and claw and, you know, this kind of competition and survival. And it's like, well, actually, sometimes you've got individuals in a species helping each other, and sometimes you've got different species helping each other. Symbiosis is there, you know, throughout biology. And we're bad at telling those stories as well. I don't know why. We like the nature red in tooth and claw more than the idea of people helping each other.
Yeah. Well, we didn't exactly valorize many ancients when we were talking about classics, but we didn't. In fact, we did the opposite. We trash talked them all.
Yeah.
You did have a lot of time. It's about you. You did have a lot of time for the need, especially us today, to look back at the way of life in the ancient world, the individual lives that were lived, and learn from them. And that was quite an important value for you, actually. I don't mind going so far as that. Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
I think there's something, it bothers me a lot, you know, this, that classics isn't taught as much in the state sector as I think it could be. And so although there's an increase in people doing classics in translation, in other words, in state schools, which is brilliant. And thanks to people like Professor Edith Hall, who have promoted classics being taught in state schools so hard, and offering training material to non-classics teachers so they can learn to teach classics as well, or, you know, on the side, I guess, as a nefarious habit. But it bothers me that the teaching of the languages of antiquity, particularly Latin and even more so Greek, is not entirely but is mostly withheld from state school students. The majority of classics language teaching happens in private schools, which is only 7% of students. And that's okay if you want to dismiss classics as being elitist, but classics isn't elitist. We've just limited it to an elite and then thrown rocks at it, which kind of bothers me as a way of looking at things. I think everybody has the right to study classics because it's studying an entire civilization, multiple civilizations. Yeah. It's studying the science of an ancient world, the literature, the visual arts, the society, the philosophy, it's all of it. And studying classics has brought me the greatest pleasure over decades of my life. I took, I guess, a version of classical studies at 11. I started Latin at 12, Greek at 14. I took triple classics A-levels, which no one would let you do now, rightly, I'm sure, because it qualified me to be exactly who I am now. Very little else. And it has brought me great joy. And I want everyone to have access to classics as much as is possible. And so I'm lucky that I get to make the radio series, Stands Up for the Classics, for Radio 4, which gets, because the BBC has such cultural penetration in this country, gets enormous listenership. I'm lucky that I get to write books about it. But I always feel like I have been really lucky, and that I have a sort of, I don't know, moral obligation sounds so wanky, but you know what I mean. I feel like
a room of humanists, moral obligation. It's okay.
Just fine.
We accept moral obligation.
Then let's go right ahead with it. I feel I have a moral obligation to give the thing that I was lucky enough to get out into the world so that other people can have access to it. And the number of people I get mailing or coming to events to tell me that they started studying.
Of all ages.
Oh, God, It just kills me. And my absolute... If you want to make me cry from 100 yards...
Let's do it.
Then either... Show me a picture of a sad horse on the news. That will always do it. Why has no one trimmed his hooves? I weep. Right? Or be a person who comes to an event and tells me that when you're now retired, that when you were 11, you either failed the 11 plus or you were put in the wrong set because you were somehow deemed not worthy of learning Latin. NB, Latin is not a difficult language. So if, as a teacher, you've decided that a kid can't learn it, then I think you should take a long, hard look at yourself because it's not Latin that's the problem here, and I'm absolutely certain it's not an 11-year-old kid. So
Greek
is difficult.
Language,
Greek, I will give you, is difficult. But Latin isn't.
No.
And so this person has been, and it happens several times a year to me. This person was somehow made to believe they weren't good enough for Latin as a child, and they have spent a whole working life believing that, their whole education and then their working life, and then they retire, and they think, I can do the thing I want finally, and then they start doing their Open University degree in classics. And it's like, how was there ever a system which made you feel like you weren't good enough for classics when instead you were always good enough for it? You were passionate about it, you were interested in it, you've had this fire burning in you this entire time, and somehow you were cut off from it. And it kills me every single time. It's like, how was this okay? So my greatest pleasure, I think, probably comes when people come to events to say, oh yeah, I didn't think it was for me. I'd stopped studying, or I'd stopped sometimes reading. People often get burned out when they're doing their A-levels or their degree, and they say, I just couldn't do it anymore, and I dropped out, or I took a break, or I thought it wasn't for me, and then I came back to it because I heard this radio program and I was laughing and I forgot I couldn't learn. And it's like, yeah, okay.
And the value, the value of the last thing on classics, maybe. But the it's not the last.
No,
another job you can do if you do 3 classics A-levels is, of course, Chief Executive of Humanist UK.
Facts.
So yeah, that's another job that you can. We should swap sometime.
Should be doing the whole thing in Latin.
Job share. In fact, we should, yes, or Greek. It's not just the value of learning another language or another culture, which is obviously any language you learn will augment your inner life, but also specifically the ancient world, which has inspired so much of our own culture. You talk, for example, about soap operas.
Yeah, of course. I made a documentary a long time ago now, before we started doing Stand Up for the Classics, which will hit its 11th series next year.
Brilliant.
Thank you. But before we did that, I made a programme for Radio 4 about Aristotle and soap opera called Oedipus Enders. Thank you. In which we looked at the principles of drama as proposed by Aristotle in his Poetics and how they applied to soap opera. And, this is exactly the kind of thing that I want to... I hate the idea that classics or that Aristotle should somehow be, only applied to high. I don't even acknowledge really the existence of high art. All art is art. It's either good art or bad art. The height of it is irrelevant, frankly. And soap has the exact same quality as tragedy and antiquity did, which is that it's open to everyone to watch. Not probably women at the Dionysia, unfortunately. But perhaps at later point. Anyway, we can't really go down that route too far, I realise. But the principles that Aristotle proposed in the Poetics about what makes drama important, first mythos, plot, then ethos, character, then dianoia, the kind of inner lives, the thoughts of the character, and then dialogue, and then music, and then last of all, the kind of the spectacle of it, the special effects, if you prefer. Those principles are absolutely, soap operas are all about plot. They have unity of time, unity of place, exactly as Aristotle proposes. Unity of place is so important in soaps that it's almost always the title. Coronation Street is set where? This isn't a trick question. EastEnders is set where? Also not a trick question, and so on and so on. They have unity of place. If somebody in EastEnders goes to Manchester, it's the same as if they've died.
We've all felt that way.
They're your audience watching at home, babe. You just go right ahead.
Oh yeah, there are people joining us on live stream from Manchester. This is good to see you, and you're welcome. You're welcome here. Yeah. Moving on. Your interview didn't end up in the science section in the end in this book. I don't know whether you noticed that.
Is that a mistake?
No, it's not a mistake. No, it's very attentive editing on the part of me. Because there was a section at the beginning, reason, science and truth. And then your bit ended up in culture and equality, which is interesting. But they were just the themes that you ended up dwelling on more than others. But you did also talk about science and respect for truth and the scientific enterprise. So I think we should say something about that because it's pretty key to most humanist approach.
It was a really interesting interview to do. It's one of those interviews where I felt as though I'd learned something about myself at the end of it, which
A lot of
is
people
nice.
said that. I think I should go to therapy.
Yeah.
Become a therapist. Tell me more.
But I can see why it did end up in that section, because we did talk quite a lot about equality.
We did.
Because you were interested in where my ideas about equality came from, and I didn't really know where they came from. And we basically worked through this, like a therapy session, until we got to the point that I said, I think it is because of biology. And it is because, in biology, we have completely kicked out the idea of archetypes. So they still hang around in a slightly kind of weird way. They're like kind of ghosts that kind of haunt us. And they hang around my discipline in medicine. So you open any anatomy textbook and there's an archetypal human body in it, which is nobody's body. And it's some kind of really weird ideal body that nobody's ever seen. And I always say to my medical students that there is no archetypal human body and there's no ideal human body. There are human bodies. And in biology, there's not a perfect example of a species. The species is the sum of its parts. So you can't point to a human being or a horse or an axolotl and go, this is a perfect example of it. It's on its own, it's not. It's just an individual. And the species is the sum of all the variation that exists in that species, which is a nice thought, because it means that all of you, if there's either no perfect human being or everyone's a perfect human being. So you're all a unique, perfect example of Homo sapiens. And there's no more perfect or unique example of Homo sapiens. You're all it. And I think that holds within it this idea of equality.
Yeah.
Because it means that nobody's worth more than anybody else.
Right, yeah. I mean, everyone talked about human equality. All of the 30 contributors that ended up in this book, and almost all of the podcast episodes that didn't end up in this book, all talked about somehow, even without sometimes mentioning the word, about the idea of the basic equality of human persons, and had 100 different groundings for it. I mean, that was what was really interesting, is that, with Rebecca Goldstein, she said, that of course she believes in human equality because she thinks that she matters, and who's she? She's nothing special, so she's got to assume that everyone else thinks they matter too, and just for that reason alone, everyone must matter the same, and that was a sort of rather tortured way of thinking about it. But Rebecca, if you're watching, it makes perfect sense. And there were biological reasons, there were cultural reasons, there were pragmatic, practical reasons, there were some reasons that were ideological, some reasons that were, there's loads and loads of different reasons. And I think that's really interesting. I don't know, the one person who didn't mention equality was Jim Al-Khalili. I ought to talk to him about that, now that I come to think about it. I know all of these interviews off by heart now, by the way, so I could... He did mention heroes, though. Jim heroises various scientists.
I think you have to put them on. I think it's probably part of how brains work and how we understand the world and how we make stories. But you just have to be very brutally honest with yourself and know that if you're putting someone on a pedestal, it has to be a very small pedestal, and they are likely to fall off at some point.
Yeah, it's a pedestal about the height of a thin, hard-backed book.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely. Yeah. About that.
Available at all good bookstores.
Yeah.
Jim did talk there a lot about truth and science, and so did various people. And so I think we should talk a little bit more about science, as I said before we got diverted once again onto equality. And specifically, what he talked about was the need he thought for the public square to be. We'll take a last discussion point on this, and then we'll come to the room. So start thinking of your perfect questions that you all ask. He talked a lot about the public square and how it needed to be more infused with the sort of scientific mindset. A lot of people talked about that as well, and pretty much inescapable.
But then it's not, that comes back to my original point, which is that I don't think the scientific mindset is that different from the historical mindset.
Okay.
But it is that idea that there is objective truth out there.
Right. So
I think that's really important.
And reason.
Yeah.
Rather than science itself.
Yeah.
Get behind truth and reason, can't
I'm really here for truth and reason.
Absolutely. We're all here for truth and reason.
Facts.
And Diet Coke.
Yeah.
let's hear a cheer for truth and reason. You know, that's what, yeah, it's truth and reason. Right. I bet you've got some ideas, haven't you? You perfect specimens that you are. Now that we know, there's no such thing as a bad question.
Oh, that's not true.
There's...
I mean, what's your favourite is a bad question, because I'm bored already before you've even finished the sentence.
Who's your favourite Greek playwright?
See? It's like, oh
God.
It's
so lazy. Yeah.
Wow, all right, fine.
If you're interviewed by somebody about a book, for instance, and they ask you that, you go, you haven't read it.
Yeah.
Clearly.
And also, if somebody begins a question with the words, I just want to say, and then ends it with, don't you agree? But in the end is a really, really, really fucking long, boring paragraph. That's not a good question either. So I'm just saying there are bad questions, don't give me one. We rise up against the bad questions.
Sometimes they're not questions at all.
They're not, they're just
sometimes
statements.
they're just a comment.
Yeah.
You can all... If anyone is brave enough to ask a question at this point, then please feel relatively free to do so. Okay, the first hand went up in the middle row, and then we'll come down to you. Yeah, keep it up. Leopard print. You need to use the microphone.
Because we're getting a mic to you.
Otherwise, the children, to whom I apologise for the F word, watching at home in Manchester won't hear you. So do use the microphone.
Well, I do feel quite brave.
You are brave. You're great.
We embrace this. Yeah.
But I'm taking the risk because it says philosophies to live by. I haven't read the book, obviously. And
Cutting.
I was buying it tonight.
Oh, okay.
So I was interested in, it's not what your favourite philosophy of life is, but what interested you most about the various philosophies of life represented in the book?
Read the book.
See, this is already a better question than what's your favourite philosophy of life. Everyone, watch and learn.
You enjoyed Samira Ahmed's interview, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I really like the podcast. It's such a diverse podcast. I mean, I like that kind of. I like those interviews where you learn about people and you learn about people from different backgrounds. I like Desert Island Disc because you listen to people's lives and you think, well, I never would have sought out this person who writes opera that I'm not interested in at all. But their life is utterly fascinating, and I'm learning so much about them as a person. So it's really diverse. I totally recommend the book. I mean, the book is great. It's like a handout. But the podcast is wonderful as well, and it's a very good accompaniment on a dog walk, I must say, which is where I listen to most of my podcasts. But yeah, Samira Ahmed's I thought was wonderful. Yeah, I learned a lot about her and her kind of the motivations for what she did, because she's such a wonderful journalist and particularly interviewer, absolutely consummate interviewer. And you were asking her about, I mean, I suppose, for want of a better word, her technique and how she got people to open up, because she really does extraordinarily, do these interviews where people tell her things, and you are watching it, thinking, I actually cannot believe this person is saying this to her. That they are opening up in a way that they're revealing something which they probably don't want to, or in that moment they do want to, because she's created this environment for them to step into and share. And I thought that was really fascinating. But also her motivations for doing that, and her really strong belief in that kind of, it is hard journalism. It's the best kind of journalism as a force for good, and as something which is absolutely essential to democracy.
She made that. Yeah, that was good.
Yeah.
And she made that point too. And then she went through a similar process to you, actually, where she said afterwards, that we didn't put this bit in, when she said, I didn't know where that had come from, but then in the course of discussion I realised, this about myself, and I think that was quite nice. I think Alf Dubs is a lovely one for me in here, because for Alf Dubs and Joan Bakewell, it's because they're, I mean, obviously may they live forever, but perhaps when a life is drawing further to its end than to its beginning, I did feel that they both had an incredibly rich perspective on their own sort of personal journey, which then informed their approach to life, and as age will do, age and experience will change your approach to life. It will, whether you like it or not.
All right then.
Yeah,
I believe you.
And you also enjoyed some of these.
I mean, I was thinking about the Nicomachean Ethics, truthfully.
Oh, yeah, well, why not?
Which I don't think we did discuss.
No.
But in my defence, we did our interview during lockdowns, and I was insane. And because I was living on my own, so I probably hadn't spoken to anyone for like a month. And it really feels like it. At every stage, I don't quite begin every answer with, thank you for talking to me, but I in essence do that. So let's just address that. So I'm not sure if we discussed the Nicomachean Ethics or not, truthfully, but I really like the philosophy of happiness espoused in that, which is that you can, essentially, you're most likely to be happy, and Aristotle is very keen to acknowledge the role of luck in your life. So I'm really very over the idea that if you kind of want it enough, or just try hard enough, or just get up early enough, or do all the things, it's like, well, yes, but you can still have an incredibly awful life, and you have no say over things that happen to you a lot of the time. But allowing for that, Aristotle's idea in the Nicomachean Ethics is roughly that you'll be happiest if you find the thing that you're really good at and then do it to the best of your ability. And unless you are like a serial killer or something, then obviously that's not something I would like you to practice to the best of your ability. But as a general rule, I think...
And even then you would be happy.
You would be, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure net human happiness would be increased.
No.
But I suppose it would depend how successful you were. But that's a separate point to make. But I guess I really like that as a way of looking at the world, that you should find the thing that you like doing and are good at doing and do it as well as you can. And there are days when I think everything is a bit too difficult and I would really like to just, lie down on the floor and have a small rest. But mostly, the thing that I do with my time is write and talk about the thing I am passionate about and think everyone has access to. And that feels all right, actually, as a way of looking back at a year. You think, yeah, I did that. Great, good. Let's do more of that. Excellent.
Yes, at the front. This is going to be a good question to you, don't worry.
I'd just like to say... No, not really, no.
Look at my interested face.
Yeah.
There it is.
I've got you now, haven't I? Actually, I'm scared as hell now, because I wasn't expecting the last question to take so long to answer, and now I'm like this.
Oh, no.
Don't worry about it. Take a deep breath.
But I was just interested, actually, because this came up on my Facebook yesterday, and I was wondering, obviously, we were talking earlier about where we come from and where we're going, and obviously I'm still learning about all this humanist side of things. It's all quite new to me, but I was just wondering if Alex could answer where this comes in your journey.
What's that? Honestly, I don't know where this came from. It was suddenly all my friends contacted me and said, oh my God, we've seen this thing. So when I was 14, I won a Blue Peter competition.
Yes.
Well done.
Yeah.
I never watched Blue Peter, did you?
And do you know, it's...
Of course I watched Blue Peter. Why didn't you watch Blue Peter?
No, I wasn't allowed to watch it.
Oh, no.
But it's always... No, it's... I was slightly annoyed because the competition, it's a bit like the one with the cat, where the cat wasn't named. I think there was a big trauma, wasn't there, in the BBC about some kind of thing with the cat where they'd actually named it already. But with that one, I won a competition to design the cover of the Radio Times, and then my picture wasn't the cover of the Radio Times. So I was really quite cross. I know. Yes. I know. That's a very good reaction. Thank you. But the main thing I feel about looking back at that, and that awkward 14-year-old that I was, is how absolutely wonderful it was to meet Karen Keating, and what an amazing woman she was. She was absolutely wonderful, and she was one of the presenters, obviously, of Blue Peter, And she was so lovely to me as this kind of geeky, gawky 14-year-old. And I spent quite a bit of time with her because we spent a day at the print run watching it roll off the press, and we went and did a little film there as well.
Is that when you found out you weren't on the cover?
Oh yeah, maybe.
This is so heartbreaking to me.
Oh,
she looked after you, Karen.
But she looked after me, and and then obviously she died young of breast cancer, and it's very sad indeed. It's a very precious memory for me. Yeah, thank you.
I think every Blue Peter presenter I've ever met has been one of the loveliest people. Our patron Janet Ellis, who's also in the book.
Yeah. Oh yes.
And I think that was one of the first interviews we did actually in lockdown. She's just one of the loveliest people in the world. You know, I think it's sort of, they audition and they test them for loveliness.
That's right.
Before they even let them anywhere.
Her daughter's another lovely person as well, and she's got her own podcast, and she's. And
she came out as a humanist on that podcast.
Yeah, she did, I think. Yeah.
Ah, there you go.
I suppose if you do live TV with, children and animals, you have to be really confident that person isn't going to go, Gah! Right.
Yes, they test them to their limits, I expect.
That's what I'm thinking.
To do that. And they all passed. Yes. And then we go back a row. Where were we? We've got the luxury of time, so don't feel. Make your question.
Fantastic. That's a question for both of you. Alice, what would you find most inspiring about the classics, ancient history? And Natalie, what do you find most inspiring about biology and genetics?
This is sort of a blind date moment. Think of me as the screen between you and describe your perfect science experience.
I can answer that because we were talking in the green room earlier, and I was saying how amazing it is. The thing which I find utterly inspirational and incredible is the technology, and it is such an amazing technology when it comes along, that allows us to hear people's thoughts, to read people's thoughts, to read their stories and their philosophy and their perspective on the world from thousands of years ago. And it's a crazy thing to be able to do. And that when you are actually reading those words, you are very, very close to that individual. It's just extraordinary. I find it consistently mind-blowing. And my Latin and my Greek is very, very basic and rusty, GCSE level. But when I've been writing about periods of history where there are contemporary sources that are either written in Latin or Greek, there are some very generous-hearted people who have done things online, like put the original text in the Greek or the Latin with a translation opposite it, and that helps me a lot because then I can look at the original Greek or Latin, and then I've got the translation to go with it, and that's lovely. But it's lovely being able to go back to that and go, those are the actual words that were written down all those years ago. So I find that utterly inspirational. And what an amazing thing that we do. So and then all the technology that we've got now, which is incredible. We can share stories like that around the world in the blink of an eye. We're very good at sharing bad stories around the world in the blink of an eye. But we have this ability to share stories and to project them through time and space. But it all started with that written word. It's really incredible. And I was lucky enough to do a television programme last year where I went to Herculaneum again, and I'd not been there since I was a teenager, so that was another lovely revisit for me, and met an amazing kind of pioneering, doggedly persistent guy called Brent Seals, who for 20 years was sure that he could come up with a way of reading the unreadable Herculaneum scrolls, and he's finally done it. And we made a programme about it for Channel 5, which I think ridiculously was called The Lost Scrolls of Pompeii, because they're not.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Just the wrong postcode.
Yeah.
But I was lucky enough to see the kind of proof of concept and the first word that had emerged from inside this kind of, honestly, they just look like things you put on the barbecue. And they are scrolls that are completely carbonised. And he's had to scan them. He brought them to Britain to scan them in diamond light, our synchrotron, high energy X-rays. So that was the first thing, to get the degree of resolution that you would need. And then you've got this, what seems like a just impossible puzzle, which is detecting molecules of carbon ink on carbonised papyrus.
Yeah.
And the whole thing is curled up and then bent, and using AI to virtually unroll it. And the first word I saw was purple.
Yeah, porphyry.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's my science answer too. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm here all day long for the reading of DNA of dead... And only in the last few weeks we've had a fantastic thing from actual Pompeii, not Herculaneum, where it just goes to show that with the best will in the world, everyone is prejudiced, because there are bodies that are found, have been found in Pompeii, in specific kind of settings, and people jump to erroneous conclusions. So when they saw 2 adults and 2 children, they said parents and their children, and that must be right. Or, you know, they're mothers and children, or it's a mother and her 2 children, and then it turns out it's 2 men and children, and people are like, wait, what? And you go, I know. Turns out it isn't always as you assume, this sort of nuclear family unit, although that's an unfortunate adjective, I guess, for people who were destroyed in a gigantic eruption. But it turns out that, you know, archaeologists aren't immune to that kind of really unconscious and mild bias either, but it means that we're looking at things inaccurately. So it is brilliant when we find these things out. But like you, the written word is really my bit of classics. So seeing these papyri from Herculaneum, there are hundreds. We've lost between 97 and 99% of ancient literature.
Is it that much?
Yeah.
I mean, Catherine Nixie is here maybe tonight, and her brilliant book.
I've just seen a message flash on my phone post, so she might be
she might not
on
be
the
here.
way.
Well, anyway, I would very much recommend Catherine Nix's book, The Darkening Age, which will tell you a bit more about the loss of ancient literature. But we've lost almost all of it.
Almost everything.
And, you know, it's when you think that, for example, and a lot of what we find when we find it, you know, the Oxyrhynchus papyri, you know, there are a lot of receipts, and you're like, oh, man.
It's really sad.
We have 7 plays by Sophocles, plus fragments of plenty more, but he wrote between 100 and 150. I would quite like more of those, and maybe some of them were in these libraries in Herculaneum, where these rolled up scrolls have survived to us, but carbonized to the point where you couldn't open them without destroying them. And if it gets to the point, and it's incredibly complicated, and once you've done all the science bit of reading these lines of text from rolled up scrolls that have then been carbonized, you then have to be able to, we need papyrologists also to read what they can see, because there is no lowercase, only block capitals. At that point,
no gaps.
There's no gaps. There's no punctuation. So it's a challenge to read what's going on. That's why it's so difficult sometimes with a text where you don't know if you have a character or a noun, an abstract noun. You know, that there are personifications of things like the north wind or a season. So these things are difficult, and lots of interpretation. Not strictly scientific, but fully artistic, is going to have to take place too. But the idea that we might be able to read these scrolls from Herculaneum, it keeps us up at night. I mean, this is properly...
Tell you who it's keeping up at night, though. The church.
There could be some nasty surprises, some very nasty surprises.
It hasn't gone through the filter, has it?
Exactly.
So,
exactly. Okay, was there a question over here that I saw? I felt like there was it someone on this row? Yeah. Was it you? Are you sliding? It wasn't, but maybe the other person's thought better of it. Maybe they were going to ask the same question that.
Well, having come all the way from Manchester, I feel like. I'll have a chat with you later about those.
Yeah.
My question is really thinking to current and near future. One is to do with truth and science. For Alice, really, do you have any concerns about the quality of science and the fact a lot of it's proving to be irreproducible by the sheer quantities that are being produced at the moment? And in the same way, if you're a historian looking back at this time with so much fake news, do you think it'll be hard to decipher the truth?
Oh, that's a really good question about truth again.
Another truth one, but also a history one. Well,
I think the thing that we have to think about, difficult though it is, to wade through the reams and reams and reams of falsehoods for every truth, which always makes me think of Book 4 of the Aeneid, you know, where rumour is a monster with all these different eyes and tongues.
Everywhere.
And the idea that as soon as something happens, it's known about everywhere, long before the true story or any kind of, you know, moral defence could be offered. But I guess, even though that's the case, what we have now is the capacity to hear the voices of ordinary people in a way that has never really been possible until now. And that's not nothing. When you look at the writing that survives to us from antiquity, it is vastly, you know, unrepresentative. It is basically posh citizen men, because they're the ones who were educated and had the time to write. And then that work has been assessed by other posh men, usually in the church, to be worthy of being... And they make the most bizarre choices. Who would have ever thought that any period of Christianity would find Juvenal morally advisable or acceptable, as opposed to absolute filth, which he is. But they did, and that's why we have the 16 satires of Juvenal.
In the monastery, you've got to have something to...
I mean,
you know.
Yeah, it's like monastery Playboy, I guess. But they can put that on the cover of the Penguin Classic.
They can.
But finally, we have the voices of people who have been historically marginalised and are still marginalised. We have the voices of people, for all that, you know, we might get slightly kind of about anonymity when people are hurling abuse and threats at you online. We have the voices of people we've never, ever had the ability to hear before. And it does change, I think, the way that we look at the world. And so I think future historians, yes, you're right, of course, they'll be drowning in a sea of material, and choosing between what's present and what's important, or what's popular and what's true, is going to be a difficult and pretty painstaking process for them. But they'll have the option of hearing voices that we often haven't had. You know, when I'm looking at someone like Sappho, who wrote 9 books of lyric poetry, we have 3 poems and the rest are tiny fragments, sometimes just a word long. So being able to hear the voices of women, just, you know, to pick one, not minority, out of the air, will make future historians have a more balanced picture of the past, I think, than we can have.
Do you want to say anything about science?
Yeah, I think we're in a really interesting period for science in all sorts of ways. You know, the era of big data and being able to answer some questions which were completely insoluble before, and I think that's really exciting. The use of AI to tackle all sorts of challenges. I'm particularly excited about the use of AI in medicine. It is going to revolutionise healthcare, and quite quickly, I think, in some ways that we can imagine and some ways that we can't. I mean, we're already in a position where we're using AI to read X-rays, and it's extremely good at spotting problems, diseases on X-rays, that kind of thing. In terms of the process of science, I'm not too worried about that, because it does feel like quite a robust system that we've got. You know, we have built something up which does work. We know it works, and it works because it is about reproducibility of results, and it is about peer review, and it is about constant testing. You know, the idea that science isn't about trying to prove something, it is about trying to disprove things. so that you know, the very beginning is coming up with those hypotheses, which are all stories about how the world works, and then you try and knock them down in as many ingenious ways as you can until you're left with the last man standing, which is probably going to be the best explanation you have for how the world works. It's as close to truth as we can get. And I think as long as we carry on with that, that has proven itself to be an exceptional way of approaching the world, and an exceptional way of stripping away our own biases and prejudices as well. So I don't think there's anything which is directly threatening that at the moment. I think that there are some things where you can see how science can be misused, or you can see that people are casting, aspersions and criticising science and scientists. But I hope that, generally, I think people, the public, have quite a high level of trust in scientists, and I think that is right, because I don't think, if you think about what scientists are doing in their labs, or however they're working, because not all of them work in labs, most of them are trying to make the world a better place. They're doing it because they believe in making the world a better place and doing the thing which they're good at to the best of their ability. They're not doing it for nefarious, malevolent ends. And a lot of them are, working in universities and working towards making the world a better place. I do believe in universities as a force for good, and I do get worried when I hear some politicians laying into universities, because universities are about the next generation of people coming through and education, but they are also about pushing the envelope about what we know across all the subjects. And I can understand that for some politicians that is worrying, because they want to control the knowledge in the same way that the church wanted to control all the knowledge and was very careful about what made it through from classical civilization to the present day. But actually, you can't control that knowledge, and we have to invest in it as a society and keep it growing. It does feed back, and it does make lives better in all sorts of really, kind of observable, measurable, meaningful ways. During COVID, I think we saw the best and the worst of people in all sorts of ways. I think that we saw, in terms of the way that science was deployed, we saw some incredible things. So we saw, and science and technology. Let's talk about the two. So the knowledge, but then the application of the knowledge. So I think that the development of a vaccine within a year is as immense a scientific feat as putting a probe on Mars. It was an incredible scientific feat, and it shows what we can do when we put enough money into it, I can tell you. And there were a lot of people worried about whether there were enough checks and balances, and yes, there were, because we just had so many things running in parallel, and it was about putting our resources into that. So that was incredible. What was really, really disappointing from the point of view of equality and humanism and everything else, and just being a person, was the way that resources were hoarded. And once we had vaccines, there was a terrible tendency for countries that had the vaccines to hoard them and not to spread them around the world equitably. And behaving like kind of medieval city-states and pulling up drawbridges and all of that kind of thing. So, but I think in terms of, and also what scientists did, working supranationally, very quickly, and all the technology that we've got now, which builds on writing all those centuries, millennia ago, this technology to communicate quickly around the world, the way that everybody around the world was just sharing data. And they're not waiting, they're not talking to their statesmen to say, is it okay if we share this data with somebody in another country? That everybody was just sharing data and working in this kind of supranational way. It was incredible. So that gives me hope.
I'm going to take the question from the woman at the front here, and then I'm going to check online, because I forgot I meant to. I'll make sure there's a question from online is meant to be, in case there's more people from other wonderful places. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
I want to come back on the women's voices aspect. I've spent the afternoon at the Medieval Women exhibition, which I know is way too modern for you two.
It is. That's current affairs to me.
But I was getting crosser and crosser about the women who have been squashed and written out of history, and even now the women who are written out of art and culture. And I want to know if you two superstars are addressing that in your everyday activities. Natalie, I know you go into schools and speak to pupils. Do you have that in the back of your mind, women specifically?
Always. I mean, my novels are only about women. My non-fiction books, the last two, Pandora's Jar and Divine Might, are about women. I think I might write one about men at some point, but I'll probably frame it through like the women they've assaulted. Because I do try and put, if your narrative is only about men, then that's okay, but unless it's as good as the Philoctetes by Sophocles, I'm not interested in it. Because I've heard loads of stories about men, and some of them are amazing. Some of them are the Philoctetes. But I don't need like one more meh story about men, because there are so many. And I've read or heard or seen, so I just don't need any more. I certainly don't need to write any. So when I look at Greek myth as my particular interest, as I think you know, then my question is not who is the hero in this narrative. My question is, why do we think that guy is the hero? Because often they really aren't. And often there are loads of questions that these are in our ancient sources, which show incredibly unheroic patterns of behavior. And you find ancient writers saying, writing about Theseus, and that he has, quite difficult relationships with women, many marriages that start badly and don't end well. And it's like, well, when someone in antiquity is throwing shade over you for being a terrible boyfriend/husband and serial killer of women, then you can reasonably well assume that person is appalling by any stretch of it. And yet somehow we all grow up going, oh, Theseus, yeah, he's the hero who goes and kills the Minotaur. Well, you know what? Borges wrote The House of Asterion last century, and that centres the Minotaur as opposed to Theseus. And it is properly one of the number of times it's happened to me is, I think, 2 or 3. The time I read a story, in this case by a man and only about male characters, that changed my life. And I knew as I read it that I would never be the same again, and I wasn't. And so putting women at the centre of narratives is my way of addressing the historic inequalities in classics and classical reception. There are plenty of others, and there are plenty of other people doing it, but I'm probably not done for a while yet, because every time I look at one of these stories, I'm like, for fuck's sake. Every time.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's always something that is at the kind of front of my mind when I'm writing, but also when I'm making television. And I think representation on television is incredibly important. I did a book a while ago for the Folio Society, which was lovely, and it was a book of science. So it was a compilation of science through the ages, and it was quite diverse. So lots of different types of science, and I looked at the science compilations that were out there, and honestly, I think the Oxford Book of Science Writing was 98% male. It was quite jaw-dropping. And so I said to the Folio Society, I'd like to write this book. I would like to do the compilation, to choose the excerpts, to choose the extracts and assemble it. But I want it to be equal, and I want it to be 50-50, male and female. And they said, all right, but we think it's going to be hard. And it is harder the further you go back, because the people that were writing were the men, the educated men. So it was difficult going, all the way back, and the ancient Greek ones were obviously men. But then actually what I found is that my task wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be, because not only had there been fewer women writing about science and doing science in the past than men, the ones that had been there had been selectively forgotten, but they were there. So, I mean, that was extraordinary, and a real kind of revelation to me to realise that actually there were more women doing science, going back quite a few centuries, than I'd expected to find, and doing really, really good science as well. So I was really pleased to be able to finish and actually have equal representation in that book. And then I think in terms of television, it is getting better. And over the course of my career, and I've been making television now for nearly a quarter of a century, it has got very different. And, I think the fact that I'm still making television now, and I'm still making a big series for the BBC and fronting that every year, and I'm an older woman doing that. There weren't that many older women fronting series 25 years ago. So I think we're seeing a big change there. There's still not enough of us, actually. And then when I look the other way as well, I wonder where the next generation is coming from. I think we're maybe taking our eye slightly off the ball at the moment. I mean, I love Digging for Britain because we always make sure we have lots of diverse voices there, not just male, female, but all sorts of diversity, as much diversity as we can get, because you're watching archaeologists, but all these, all the different sciences that come around archaeology as well. And I think it's really important to see a variety of people who are doing those jobs, so that you've got people, there will be kids watching that going, oh, that could be me. And it is important to have people that are, you can relate to, and you're not just seeing the same people all the time. So we do bear that in mind. I'm so pleased that my lovely friend Stuart Pryor is presenting with me on Digging for Britain, and I didn't think I'd actually seen an archaeologist with a disability on television before. So, and he's not just there because of his disability, he's there because he's a fantastic medieval archaeologist. But yeah, so I think it's really important that we think about that all the time when we're engaging with the public, whether that's book writing or television or whatever it is we do. Yeah.
I'd say another book that's 50-50 men and women is... Well, I forgot its title.
At least it's not the
Little Book of Humanism.
Can I say one more thing about that, though?
Yes, but then we'll have to finish.
All right. The one more thing is that sometimes I get asked to, particularly talk to girls in schools or young women in schools about science and trying to encourage them to do science, and that, I think, for me is very problematic. It's problematic because science isn't one thing, and we have plenty of girls and young women studying biology and psychology at both school and in university. Medicine is now more female than male. And then you look at physics and engineering, and that is extremely male still. Now, these subjects are not gendered. They have no gender. There's nothing gendered about them. There's no reason why it should be like that other than that it's cultural. So I do think we need to, tackle those cultural issues. I find it extraordinary. Every now and then there are stories in the news about particular teachers. There was a head teacher fairly recently who said something along the lines of, girls can't, or girls aren't as good at physics, or we shouldn't be trying to force girls to do things they're not good at. And it's like, well, hang on a minute. You're coming at this completely the wrong way, and also you are coming at it from this kind of biological essentialist perspective. So, yeah, I think we need to get rid of the idea that those subjects are gendered, but we need to do it for both. We need to, why have we got boys not interested in biology and psychology? So while we're working hard on opening up physics and engineering to girls. We need to work hard on opening up, there might be some boys who would like to do psychology, but they can't do it because they just don't think it's for them. Yeah.
Well, online, everyone's the same. I mean, I don't know whether it's a male or a female question, but in any case, I haven't got any reception, so I can't read any of the questions. And it's a good job, too, because your question was so excellent. It's a wonderful one to finish on. And finishing we will be. But I just wanted to read you a letter we received at the office, because I mentioned the original, what I believe, were essays by Bertrand Russell and Ian Forster. But then there was in 1940, there was a book published, which was a collection of essays by various humanists under the title of What I Believe, and I mention it in the introduction to this book. And last week, we got a letter from the son of the man who had produced it. And exactly. My father was involved in the editing and production of this book in the 1940s. My father became a humanist while working at George Allen and Unwin, which was the publisher, because although he came from a mildly Church of England background, he had fallen under the influence of humanists by meeting the many great and good of the humanist world by working at the publishers. And he raised us boys to be the same. Even in the 1940s, it was uncomfortable to own up to being atheist in a class of secondary modern boys. The same on conscription, when it was pointed out to me that if I carried on being a humanist, I would lose all my Christmas and Easter leave.
Oh!
Doesn't say what he actually did as a result. Also, in my profession as a school teacher, no promotion if the church did not approve. I am 90 this week, and find I have an unexpected optimism and joy still in my life, which is equal to that of my happy childhood. And this comes from thinking and living with a faith in humanity's likely destiny and what we still might achieve.
Isn't that lovely?
So we might hope that this book will have the same impact on people 90 years from now. Let's hope so. You've been a wonderful audience for it. If you did pre-order it, I think, and you picked up your copy downstairs, we're about to run down and sign some of them. We've already signed some others of them, so if you've got those copies, even better. That means we're going to run from this room very quickly as you applaud. So thank you very much to Natalie and to Alice for joining us this evening, and thank you to all of you. See you later.